Haere mai, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Amy Malcolm aho. I'm Amy Malcolm and I'm the Oceania Ambassador for World Creativity and Innovation Week. And I'm here today with Professor Peter O'Connor, the Director of the Centre for Arts and Social Transformation at the University of Auckland.
Oh, kia ora, Amy. It's great to be here today to talk about the creative process right at the very beginning of
World Creativity and Innovation Week.
Fantastic.
So we are so excited to be coming to you from New Zealand, and we have engaged a whole lot of our really cool creative friends from around the world to talk to you today about what it means to be creative and how to have a creative environment.
One of the things that we've been working on here at the university is how do you demystify the creative process? How do we kind of convince people that we're all born creative? So what we came up with, Amy, as you know, is this idea of the 11 dimensions. And it's saying that the creative process is a multi-dimensional process, and that if you're taking risks, if you're trusting other people, you're collaborating, you're taking ideas from one discipline area and putting it together, you're being creative.
So you mean we're all creative?
We're all creative. That's the exciting thing about life, isn't it? It's actually what makes us really human, truly and fully human. So the great thing is we've got some real experts from around the world to talk to us about that over the coming hour.
So we're going to break down these 11 dimensions of creativity. We're going to start by showing you a little animation that we've produced that helps you to understand what we mean when we say play or curiosity or
risk-taking.
And then we're going to talk to our friends about how they see it. And then at the end we might have a discussion, and of course we're always interested in what you think too.
And the really good thing we think is that you look at it and you go, I don't think they're right. And that's part of the creative process, isn't it? Getting an idea and going, oh, I wonder if, maybe. We're really lucky today to have Justin Brown, a good colleague and friend of us here at the University of Auckland, oversee these conversations. Sit back, don't relax, keep thinking, keep feeling, and keep imagining that we're all in this together, being creative.
We'll see you at the end.
See you at the end.
From the moment we open our eyes, we try to make sense of the world. From that moment, we are curious, we want to explore, we ask, why? In the blink of an eye, we leave for school with thousands of questions. We're most curious when we feel safe, when we're relaxed and playfully engaged. Curiosity sits at the heart of all human invention. Asking questions and questioning answers. The Wright brothers were curious about flight. Elon Musk asks, what would it be like to live in space? Thankfully, someone did ask, like Einstein, what if one were to run after a ray of light? It really is easy to be curious. To ask what if, what might happen, why? The question what if opens possibilities, because curiosity is an essential building block of creativity. Allow yourself to saunter. Slow down the process. Notice things.
David, humans are very good at following rules. How do we get away from conforming and being more curious?
Okay, so the first thing is humans aren't great at following rules, but what humans are great at doing is getting into a path of least resistance. And this is what we do in so many aspects of our lives without realizing we're doing it. And so the really important thing is to have a sort of metacognition about that, which simply means thinking about your thinking and saying, okay, look, what I'm doing or the answer that I just came up with, is that my brain's path of least resistance? And can I therefore do something better? And one of the things that Tony and I suggest is sending it back and, making sure whatever first idea you come up with, you're going to say, wow, that's a great idea. But to not trust it, to not believe that first idea and say, I'll bet if I dig around in there, I can get something better. And then when you get the second thing, saying, great, now I'm going to dig around for a third thing, and so on. And that's really the key.
Are you telling us we're lazy?
Yes, brains are very lazy, and they're always, they're energy efficient, and they evolved to get what they need. If you're hungry, you go and find food. You don't dance or paint or something like that. And so that's what brains are really evolved to be good at.
All right. Anthony, how does a musician be curious when they're reading from a music score?
So, a couple of weeks ago, my son and I put together an exercise bicycle, basically by just following the pictures in the instructions. And, I got a working bicycle that I can ride. And I wish a musical score were like that if you just follow the instructions on the page, you get a great performance. But actually, music notation, as comprehensive as it is, leaves out half of the necessary information that you need. And if it told you everything, we wouldn't need musical analysis, and maybe we wouldn't need to be curious. But actually, we do. And it's a very important part of musicianship. And the other thing that I would say in response to your question is, I think one of the tragedies of the whole fake news issue that we're dealing with right now in the United States is that there's never settled law in any field. I think about the way someone like David looks at science as always only a partially told story and filled with open questions. And that's necessary, perfect, and wonderful to leave things open for discussion.
Rita, when I was at school, I was told that I asked too many questions. The teacher said, you just asked too many questions, to which I sort of replied, how can you ask too many questions? How do we get kids to remain curious and to always question?
Well, I think it's too bad that you had that response. I would hope that today's schools are actually trying to encourage more and more questions. And in fact, the emphasis now that's on inquiry approaches, which is more learner-centered than it has been in the past. In those instances, questions are incredibly important. And in fact, as questions lead to other questions and lead to other questions and lead to other questions. So through an inquiry approach to learning, there's more of an emphasis on study and engagement, and through questions, you're pursuing knowledge that's of interest and relevant to yourself, and especially in a children's classroom to that group of children. So I would say we have to inspire in any context of learning that it is about the pursuit of questions through knowledge.
Nancy, what about you? What would you say about the importance of curiosity for business success?
Well, I think to start with, I must have had the same teacher as you had, because I was told to keep quiet and stop asking questions. But luckily, my mother, when I came home very upset, said that she and my father wanted to hear my questions, so that maybe it would be better to save those precious questions for the family.
Yeah, that's right.
Kurt, I'm curious what would happen if we made prisons more creative. What would the outcome be, possibly?
Well, as I said, focusing on creativity and moving it from the negative to the positive is a key to success. We begin with the foundation upon which to build, which is human curiosity. Like the 2-year-old child's mantra, what's this? What's this? What's this? We apply that fundamental curiosity of wanting to know, to learning to ask questions. And from curiosity is birth creativity, and our creativity is centered in the aesthetic. It finds artistic expression in art, theater, the works of Shakespeare, and in original writing.
Bruce, you've been a teacher and a director, but for someone who is not in a position of power, but is questioning the way things are best heard, how do you handle that situation? If they want to get their message across, is that about being in an open environment?
Yeah, well, you have to create a safe environment first. It's connect a lot with what Curt has been saying. It's an environment of trust and safety. And I like to create an environment that minimizes the sense of a power differential. So I always say to them, like new students, I say, we are all filmmakers. I might have done it more times than you, but you're not waiting to be a filmmaker. You're a filmmaker now. And then we exchange creativity from that point on. But I've seen people go the other way and say, I will make you a filmmaker. That's the Whiplash kind of approach, the film about the drummer. I don't think that gets the best out of people. I really don't. Young people I work with, it's Chicago. They're not shy about asking questions, and so I tell them, keep asking questions. The answer to a question is another question. If a teacher just tells you an answer and expects you to shut up, you've got the wrong teacher. That's the reality of it. If you ask questions and you help and you give the teacher or the director the opportunity to understand what you want to know and why you want to know it, the good ones will help you. If you don't get any help and make a lot of noise, if that still doesn't help you, then you're not in a creative partnership. Get out. Go find someone that you can have a creative partnership with.
It might surprise you to know that collaboration is not just teamwork. This is teamwork. Collaboration is when everyone knows their part within the team, like on a movie set. There's the director, camera operator, and actor. The All Blacks rugby team is another example of collaboration in its purest form. Each player brings unique skills to game day. There's the big bulldozer prop, specialist kicker, lightning quick winger. Whether on the rugby field or in the classroom, good collaboration is based on trust. There are very few people who make anything and don't ask the question, what do you think? Likewise, they might ask for ideas or suggestions regarding their work. Like Vincent van Gogh with his brother Theo. Collaboration means using the strengths of others, making something you could never make on your own.
Bruce, we hear a lot about collaboration these days. Why is it so important in relation to creativity?
Well, collaboration is one of the ways that creativity can be amplified, that you can get more than the sum of the parts, if you will. It can be easily thought of as summative, just add a few things together and that's collaborating. But for creativity, you really need to get something that emerges that's more than the sum of the parts. When you get that, then it can feed other things. It can feed play, can feed improvisation. It's a very powerful guide to where you can go and how you can amplify creativity. And it's also something that can help young people a great deal, can help them to quickly become creative and feel that they're creative because they're not alone in the process. So I think it's got a power that is often underestimated because it generates a certain kind of creativity.
And that might happen in film more than it would happen if you were like a solo songwriter, right? If you were trapped in your room and you didn't collaborate with other people, it's really your own thoughts. But if you're with a team and there's a whole lot of, like a film crew, would that be different, do you think?
Well, it might be, although there's quite a field of thought, a lot of people, I'm included, who feel that you're always collaborating with the history. You're always collaborating with the context. There's no such thing as the individual when it comes to creative work. Even if you're a scientist or a painter or whatever, you learn or have connection to what preceded you. You maybe have connection to what's going on through other people. So the idea that someone's on their own and solitary, and sure, I lock myself away sometimes so there's no noise and I can get stuff done. But I never for a minute think that I'm solitary and cut off from all that history and all that other creativity that's out there.
Let's bring you in here, Curt. Trust must be a really important part of collaboration too. So how do you get people who don't trust each other to collaborate?
Great question, and probably the biggest question, whether you're incarcerated or not. It's about trust. And Shakespeare Behind Bars is a voluntary program. The participants receive no good time for taking part. They choose to attend, and that's step number one towards building to trust and collaboration: attendance. They show up, and we begin to build our circle of trust. The circle of trust, of course, is fragile space to create, particularly in prison where there's so little trust. Trust must be earned, and even when it's achieved, there is the continual questioning of how deep does that trust run. So the participants must be brought to an understanding that the circle of trust is a neutral ground, a place where they can confidently come, remove their external mask, and explore their deepest selves without the fear of being betrayed. Another high level word in prison, betrayal, is a challenge because often the prisoner's life is filled with betrayal. They suffered from others, and then sadly they betrayal that they passed on to others. So life in the circle of trust is living into I. To I choose to speak in the personal rather than the collective we. I choose to live in invitation rather than demand. I choose to embrace hope rather than expectation, to labor to fix myself rather than to attempt to fix others, to share my personal story of suffering and shame rather than offering advice, to be inclusive in my thinking rather than exclusive in my thoughts, to offer non-judgment rather than condemnation, to extend justice seasoned with mercy rather than justice motivated by revenge, and to seek deeper questions rather than superficial answers. So once that process begins, then I need the ability to adapt. I need the courage to go through something I've never gone through before. I need the desire to engage, an ability to be present, the strength to be in the moment, a willingness to risk, a willingness to be vulnerable, a willingness to ask deep questions, and the courage to tell the whole truth. The goal of the circle of trust is for the participant to see each other as human beings first, to find the similarities rather than the differences each other have, and to look into each human being's heart and bypass the external features or beliefs or background. Once the creation of the circle of trust has begun, we pass out journals to each of the participants because a lot of the work is done in their writing to themselves in the journal. We create an operating manifesto. This is made up of core values from the group, selected individually by the group and put into the manifesto. We each sign a contract about what we'd like to get out of this program and what we're willing to give. There's always a get and a give. I teach relaxation exercises to relieve fear, anxiety, trauma triggers. We create an opening ritual to make the space we inhabit a sacred space. And we create a ritual handshake connecting the outer self to the inner self to the deeper self. And we begin learning to play, connecting with our inner child. And finally, we introduce Shakespeare. So after going through this process very painstakingly at the pace that the circle needs it to go, we begin to create a place where trust can be explored and collaboration.
Let's stay on collaboration, Bruce. You are many things, a musician, not least of which is one of them. But with filmmaking, can you tell us a real life example of when you've seen collaboration make a film, more creative?
Oh, yeah. Well, filmmaking is inherently creative. It's so complex that you really can't do it on your own. Sometimes little projects can happen like that, but most filmmaking is inherently collaborative. So it can work in both ways. If the relationship's weak, it can be a negative. If the relationships are strong, then it can be positive. I think the most consistent collaboration, people talk about directors and producers, but generally speaking, we in those positions are in total control. But the people we rely on who really collaborate, they're in a different position. And the two that I'm most fascinated by are the cinematographer and the designer, the production designer. When they collaborate, it's a thing of beauty. They will actually help each other to do the other's job. You sit them down, you think you're going to talk with them, and they just go off. They go off and they talk with each other, and they go way beyond what you had in your mind. The cinematographer's saying, well, you don't have to build this. I can create some shadow, I can light it, you'll be fine. And the designer's saying, I can help you out with this way of approaching the design. So in general terms, I would say there are many cases, but I would say the cinematographer and the production designer. And then I thought I would mention a project that I did in New Zealand a zillion years ago called House of Sticks. It was in the Montana series, I think, but it was done through South Pacific Pictures. I actually produced it. Nicky Marshall was the director. And that project was a collaboration in every way. Everybody collaborated on that project. And even though it didn't have a huge budget, the result was really powerful. And after we'd screen it, people would come up and say how effective it was at drawing them into what was quite a difficult story world, quite a difficult dramatic environment. So that is, I would say, just the whole collaboration on that project was a really good example from my point of view.
Anthony, let's start with you. You're an expert when you get musicians to collaborate when you compose music. What are the tricks to get the best creative output when you're getting creative talent to all work together?
Well, Justin, first of all, I would say that collaboration is maybe one of the most undervalued and unappreciated features of creativity. I mean, we're often focusing on individual minds and what's going on in our heads. But if human beings weren't so good at sharing and teamwork, honestly, human creativity would dry up. And so that ability of each other to trade ideas and connect and share is absolutely critical. And I love collaborating. And I was thinking when you were asking this question that when David and I worked on our book, we had sort of a simple rule. And that was that if either of us didn't like something, it just went. We didn't argue about it. And it was always going to be awesome to write a book with David, but having that rule meant we never had an argument, and we would just take the chance of bringing something to have the other person look at. And we went under the assumption that if it didn't reach the other person, then something was falling short.
I feel like that's maybe creative confidence too, that if you're working with David and you have a long history of doing quite amazing creative things, that it's easier to throw things out than when if you say 18 and, oh my God, this has to be my hit song or this has to be my hit book.
Well, it was really, often you'd come in with something you thought you'd beautifully articulated put, you'd said really well. And David would look at it and say, the writing is great, but it's not completely accurate. And we'd know it'd have to go. And that process itself was really reassuring in terms of building the book together. So I think being able to be honest with your collaborator and just have this open field of acceptance and both independence and the ability to come together is really important.
What about you, David? Like, what's going on in the brain during collaboration when you're collaborating with, say, Anthony or anyone else you collaborate with?
The general story is we all have an internal model of the world. We think we understand the world out there. We have the illusion that our internal model is complete, that we sort of know everything and everything is correct. And what's so great about collaboration is that you constantly bounce around new ideas and things you hadn't thought of, or a completely different angle on something that you thought you knew that you just hadn't seen before. And so exactly as Anthony is saying, two brains is always better than one, because you get these extra bits out of it, these extra insights that light up both people's faces, because neither of them had quite seen that combination before.
What tools do you need for that then? You need to be open-minded, particularly, right, for collaboration?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said. Do you need to be what?
You need to be open-minded if you're going to collaborate with other people.
Yes, it would be very difficult to collaborate with somebody who's very close-minded and thinks that their internal model is complete. It would be very difficult. Yeah, so both people need to share trust. They need to have, and Tony, with Tony and I, we had the case that we had a good friendship already, and so that was really easy. We trusted one another.
Nancy, how is collaborating during a crisis like a pandemic going to lead to more creative solutions, do you think?
Well, in a crisis such as the one we're in and have been in for the last year, we simultaneously face maximum uncertainty and maximum risk. Wrong decisions lead to death. If we're wise, we know that we don't know, and we reach out to others. So there's the heart of collaboration. If we know that we don't know, then we reach out to others, to experts. But with experts who have very different perspectives and knowledge bases from our own. And because the situation is so serious, we know we must respond. And so we know we have to reach out to others. And if we have to synthesize what we hear and what we learn into novel approaches, we know we have to do that because we know we can't use what the world has used before, because otherwise we wouldn't be facing this situation. But let me give you one example. I happened to be living in Italy at last winter. So I was there when Italy got clobbered with the pandemic. Wow. And there was a huge amount of creativity. Doesn't surprise you coming from Italy. But one of the examples I loved came from a physician, a retired physician, who realized that Italy was in huge trouble. And he reached out to, so collaboration, a swimming mask company to create a positive airway pressure mask that was needed to treat the COVID patients. But in order to do that, they had to reach out to a Rome-based startup company that did 3D printing of particular kinds of valves. And then they reached out to another company that realized that they could draw the entire mask and have it printed. And then at the very last moment, they didn't have the connector from the mask to the machine that would supply the air. So they printed that. They then went and partnered with one of Italy's leading hospitals, which was already, of course, in crisis, and the whole thing worked. So here were these swimming masks that were saving lives from a guy who, in our official vocabulary, retired physician, was supposed to be just sitting at home and doing nothing.
Incredible. Rita, what can children teach adults about collaboration?
Well, I think when children are engaged in their own aesthetic play or other sensory kinds of experiences, they're really focusing on that encounter in that environment, what's happening for them in that particular time and place. And so they're really immersed in that. And they're when they're doing that with other children, there's a kind of a collaboration that ensues, where they're both invested in that kind of sensory experience, that encounter. So my takeaway from that for adults is to pay attention to how children invest in those experiences, in those encounters, where they pay attention to all of the delight, all of the sensory, all the perceptual things that they're learning in that time and place, that they're really present in that time and place, and that they're engaging in those experiences together. I think sometimes as adults, we forget to be as present as we could be. And children are very known for being very present in their experiences. And so as children play together, that just amplifies that being very present in those encounters and experiences.
Look at this guy. He's not playing it safe. He's about to learn, find a new path, and grow. If you're a teacher, risk-taking is the kind of work you do with children where you're not too sure where the learning's going to lead to. You've got to make it safe to fail. The most valuable teachers are those who encourage children to take risks, therefore modelling that it's okay to fail. It's okay to get things wrong because it's in the learning from the failure that the value is found. As this guy said, risk-taking in life means trying things out to see if they work, not to see if you've got the right answer. If there isn't a possibility of failure, you can't actually get to success. All you're really doing is repeating what is already known. Risk-taking is saying what we already know isn't enough. And in a classroom, we can push beyond and we can find out things together.
Janis, when there is so much at stake, is society tolerant enough of risk-taking and failure?
Well, if I was following on from Jonathan, I think that point about technologies and platforms has allowed or given greater visibility to these questions of diversity and intergenerational activity. I'm not going to say it's more democratic, but it hints in that direction. Therefore, there are more risks. But we live in a very divided society because those increases in the physical world have meant that if you don't have these ways of connecting or building networks, then you are doubly isolated and trebly at risk. Now, whether a society can deal with those profound physical and mental issues, we have yet to see. But there are risks in as much as engaging with these platforms. But it's always a paradox. It opens, but it's also problematic. It does have a great impact in society, and I hope it does at some point shift it so these inequalities that we speak of, which are very profound here and have been made even more profound in the pandemic and with the visibilities we're aware of, we can only live in hope. I think that's a very good motto.
Yeah. Jonathan, because performers and artists and singers and actors often jump off a cliff to get the greatest performance. So do you think that we value failure enough? Do we value it enough?
You know, I think risk is it's tricky. I didn't with the discovering the COVID vaccines. You know, I didn't want people taking risks, you know, in science and in ways that, you know, affect public health. I don't want people taking risks. But this space that I've described between chaos and order is a creative space, but it's also a space of risk, a space of failure, and a space of fear. And I think what's been interesting in the acuteness of this tension between chaos and order is that we've learned that, you know, the biggest risk is not to take a risk. It's been inevitable. Nobody knows, you know, this is unprecedented in human history. So everything we've done to a certain extent has been taking a risk based on the information that we have. But it's also been mitigated risks, you know, mitigated by science, mitigated by data science, by analysis and everything else. So I think, you know, I think that balance is fine for me at the moment.
I'll start with you, Curt. Bob Ross, the painter, rest in peace, talked about happy little accidents. Can you give some examples of when risk-taking might have led to failure, but lessons have been learned, and then there's basically a creative outcome has been achieved?
Fortunately, as part of my creative process, I've trained myself not to be afraid of failure. My success in retrospect and looking back, my success has been built on a mountain of failures. So I don't really think of when something doesn't succeed the way I anticipate it should succeed or wish it should succeed. It's again going back for me to trust the process. That and I use scientific method with that. You know, a scientist is pursuing something to find out what the cure might be. So when they go down a road and come to the end of the road and that road hasn't been the right road, they don't really think much about it. It's like, oh, okay, we can discount that. Let's go back and pursue another process in this. And I apply that to my own thinking in working in the aesthetic, working in the arts.
What are your thoughts on that, Bruce?
Well, my students know, they learn very quickly that there's this thing called Bruce's cul-de-sac theory. So that's its name. I have this view that you have to go down dead ends. You have to go down routes that you know are not going to be the solution, like you know before you go there. And you still have to go there. And the reason you have to go there is because when you come back, you'll bring something you need that you didn't have before. It's kind of a Zen thing in a way, but I think one of the most difficult things in our educational culture is that approach is rejected because there's kind of a teach to the test approach. You know, we'll just help you get the answers so you can get the grade and everything's fine from there. But that doesn't make very flexible or adaptable creators. And so that's my main thing. I don't think it's necessarily risk. To me, risk is only meaningful against the knowledge of safety. If you don't know what's safe, you can't know what's a risk. I always think about walking on a high wire. I've never met someone who walks on a high wire who thinks they're taking a risk. They always know what safety is, and then they go do it thinking about safety. And go do it thinking about risk. They fall off in three steps. So for me, risk, especially creative risk, requires that you have a very strong sense of what its opposite is, what you are risking, rather than just taking a risk. I've never understood what a risk is.
Nancy, during a pandemic, how do you foster the importance of pushing boundaries and taking risks when failure means that people die?
I think there's actually an answer to that question. And that's to be very honest and to say that it's highly uncertain. It's very serious. We're doing the best we can, but given it's brand new, we are going to make mistakes. And I think brilliant example of that, minister, very early in the pandemic, so middle of March 11th, when she said, we are entering, this is at a press conference, we are entering an unknown territory. The situation we find ourselves in is not similar to anything we've previously experienced. We will make mistakes. Yes, we will make mistakes. I ask for your patience. We cannot answer all the questions now, but we will answer more of them as soon as possible. We will do our utmost to take care of the Danes, to take care of Denmark, to take care of each other. I think she had huge courage to come out at that moment and as a senior top leader in 2020 and say, we don't know. But the good thing about saying we don't know, but we're doing the best we can, is when you make a mistake, you've got people anchored and they don't lose faith in you. And there are many, many political leaders around the world, as well as some business leaders, et cetera, who have been disparaged, thrown out of office, thrown out of their position because they made a mistake. Because our tolerance for mistakes is relative to a world that had much more certainty than we have now. So I really like how the Danish Prime Minister approached it.
Divergent thinking is about providing opportunities to generate as many ideas as possible. So take your time. There's no need to rush to an answer. Give yourself the chance to go to different places. Forget about goals. Go where your imagination takes you. At this stage, there are no rules, no wrong answers. There will be rules later, but for now, it's free-flowing. Divergent thinking means being non-judgmental. As for the editor in your head, she can wait. Keep her locked up until you need her. You will need her because she's important, just not now. Activities to help divergent thinking. Setting time aside for thinking and meditating. Bubble mapping and brainstorming. You've got possibilities? Great! Now it's time to break them down into parts to gain insight about the various aspects of a topic. Now synthesize the ideas and you've created something new.
David, what is happening in the brain when we have an idea?
Okay, well, there are lots of things that could qualify as an idea. For example, you might do something that's sort of a rote step, but to have a creative idea is to take things that you've seen before, that you've absorbed before from the world, and to put them together in novel ways. To say, oh, I've seen this thing over here, and I once saw someone do this to this kind of thing. And if I put those together, that solves the problem that I'm looking to solve. And so a creative idea is all about remixing, or as Tony and I put it in our book, it's about bending, breaking, and blending everything that's in your storehouse of knowledge to find new solutions to things. That's what an idea is.
As a composer, how do you stop the sensible editor in your head from getting in the way of radical thinking?
Well, I think step one is don't censor yourself. And Beethoven's a great role model for that. He was deaf, so he had a conversation book where he'd write down little musical ideas, and some of them are incredibly lame. A little fragment of a scale. You wonder, why did he even bother to take the time to write it down? And then over time, you see him work it into something absolutely incredible. And it's a reminder that where you start isn't what matters. It's where you end up with an idea. And then the second thing is, it's really important to have plenty of paper or computer memory or whatever material you're working with, because if you only have one piece of paper and you have to destroy what you did before to try it another way, you're really going to be inhibited from doing that. And there are a lot of times my students will come in and they're stuck in their composition. And the first question I'll ask them is that the only piece of paper you're working on, working with? And they'll say, yeah, what's the problem? I say, okay, well, there's your problem. You won't disturb what you've already done, and so you're stuck. And so it's incredibly liberating and important to have as much raw materials to work with as you possibly can.
You could be on the beach, right? You could be writing with a stick in the beach, and the idea might come to you there. It doesn't have to be on that one particular piece of paper or computer.
Right. Totally.
Yes, although if you develop your idea there, you're in danger of it being washed away. Yeah. Actually, Justin, I just want to address something that you said earlier when you said no idea is a bad idea. I don't actually think that's the case. Most of your ideas are bad ideas, but you can't know that they're bad unless you see them in the context of all the other ideas you come up with. And when you've dumped a bunch of ideas out, then you see, wow, this one's really special. And the rest of them actually really do stink.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I really do have some bad ideas. That's what I'm saying.
Exactly.
Janis, what are some of the tools that you've seen effectively used to help people come up with a range of ideas?
Oh, in terms of looking at that area of new technologies, new platforms, I think people have had to really vary. Even though technology can be intrusive and time-consuming, it has released ways of thinking and ways of working with new people as much as old colleagues in ways that perhaps have been accelerated through the pandemic, I would suggest. Once you get over time zones.
Yeah. What about yourself, Jonathan? Divergent thinking and the ability to come up with a range of ideas for a creative project, whatever it is.
Well, I can probably save you time by putting the problem posing together with this divergent thinking question. So one thing that's to me is looking at creativity as existing in a space between chaos and order. And of course, we now find ourselves in that world where we are drifting into chaos and trying to struggle to find some new order in that. And what has astounded me has been the everyday creativity that's been required to put food on the table, to keep yourself healthy, to keep your job, to keep your children homeschooled, all of that. The crisis, the chaos, the falling into chaos has caused all of us to have to think differently about what we've taken for granted. So, and I think that will last, when we return to whatever, that sense of things don't have to be the way that they have always been. Things don't always have to be done in the same way. In moments of desperation, I do have the agency to do something about that, to restart my job, to adapt. If you look right from commercial TV film right through to everyday people in their lives, they've all adapted unbelievably rapidly and fast, I think, the new circumstances. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I absolutely put on the table, that the best way of getting a range of ideas is to make sure that you have diversity in the group. Cognitive, ethnic, intergenerational, whatever. If you put people who are the same in the room, they'll come up with the same thing. If you put people who are different, you will inevitably, as long as power is not at play, as long as they all feel that they have an equal voice, you will inevitably come up with a much richer, wider range of ideas than you otherwise might.
Synthesis is the process by which two different elements, ideas, or things are brought together in unexpected ways. Like what you're probably watching this on. Cooking is the perfect example of synthesis, whereby different ingredients are brought together to create something which is greater than the sum of its parts. But of course we can leave the safety of the kitchen. Let's go broad. Let's think bigger. For example, creative cooking might mean synthesizing or fusing together an ingredient from Italy with an ingredient from the USA. Synthesis, where existing things are made new by the way in which they're mixed together. I mean, who would have ever guessed Team New Zealand would ride bicycles to replace the part taken by grinders to make their America's Cup boat go faster? By bringing together cycling, a land-based activity, onto a boat is creative, because it synthesizes two existing products and puts them together in new and unexpected ways.
David, why are humans so good at synthesizing?
Presumably, we've evolved to synthesize because the amount of data that we actually get in our lives is very small. We have a limited sampling on the world. And so the real innovation that Mother Nature made with human brains was being super good at synthesizing things from the little impoverished data that it's taken in already so that it can generate more and more. And this is the kingdom of imagination that we can build. So this is what we do all the time. We're mostly not living in the present. We're living in possible what if worlds where we say, well, let's see, what if this happened? Oh, and what if this? And that's where we spend most of our time. And that's a great benefit for us because that allows us to take the limited input that we have and multiply it exponentially.
And Anthony, like mashups, remixes, teaming up with unlikely artists with music who might not be in their genre. Music is rife with examples of synthesis. Why, to you, is it so important?
I think because of what David just said, it's important to all creativity. It is, in a way, the essence of it. And, one way of thinking about music is creative play with patterns in sound. And I think about patterns as what creates understanding and creativity as what holds our attention when it's in something like music. And you take understanding and you give with sorry, let me say that again. Take understanding and attention, you put it together, and it's human connection. And so, one of the things about synthesis is it's a way of bringing ourselves closer to each other, which is something, as this pandemic shows, we all need as human beings.
And if I could just alley-oop off something there that Tony said, which is, so I live in Silicon Valley, and one of the questions that's always floating around here is, could computers be creative? And the answer is sort of. They can generate an enormous amount in 1 second. They can generate 100 million examples of something. But what they're missing, the part they're missing, is the human understanding part, knowing what would actually matter to us. So yes, they're generating incredible stuff, but the other half of creativity is understanding the human connection part. And for that, you need humans at Google or wherever to say, oh, okay, I'm going to pick that one out, and that one's a good one.
Nancy, can you give us examples of business that have used synthesis to come up with creative solutions?
I can give you a couple examples. I could actually give you lots. We've been doing some very creative work and some big partnerships. So if I give a lot of economically disadvantaged people across the whole country, and the pandemic was going on. In the middle of the pandemic in Washington State, there was a huge forest fire with lots of smoke that forced many people to be dislocated from their homes. And Molina decided, the senior leadership of Molina in Washington State decided almost instantly to get all of its leadership together within the company. So the marketing people, the medical people, the IT people, everybody together, and to go out and contact every single one of their clients who was at any risk. That meant, for many of them, they had to find where they were. That meant once they found where they were and asked them what they needed, which could range all the way from medications that the insurance company normally provided, to they needed food, to they needed. And then once they got that list, they had to problem solve with the logistics team of how did you get, where was there a grocery store or a pharmacy or whatever, wherever they'd been dislocated to, and get them served. That would have been impossible without the people from, as I said, the medical people within the company, the social workers, the IT. How do you prioritize? Who do you contact first? The logistics teams, how do you work? Well, needless to say, the clients were hugely grateful. That doesn't hurt business. And the employees felt absolutely wonderful that instead of being a victim of yet another natural disaster, the COVID and then the fire, that they could actually do something that made a difference.
Rita, can you tell us how synthesis works in the classroom?
So I think one of the best examples of synthesis in classrooms is when we don't put quite as much emphasis on subjects, but more on the themes or the pursuit of the study itself around a particular topic. And when that happens, that allows children to integrate knowledge across what could be subject domains, but in fact helps them to think very interdisciplinary, even as a transdisciplinary fashion. And of course, if the whole class is doing that, then you have a lot of energy for thinking beyond borders and boundaries and actually investing in particular topics and themes. So I think that's one of the better ways of showing synthesis in classrooms.
Discipline, ways of knowing the world. Mastery, doing it well. Put them together and you get discipline mastery, which for you and I means you got to know your stuff before you can make your own stuff. Movie director Quentin Tarantino, he worked in a video store before becoming a movie usher, before becoming a true master of his craft. Pablo Picasso, he was no different. a brilliant artist with a deep understanding and the mastery of skills in traditional art making. Once he knew those techniques, he busted them open. By learning from the masters who came before him, Picasso could be truly creative. Creativity is not about freedom and play alone. It is about freedom and play within constraints. Want to write a haiku? You need to know the rules and structure which make up one. The same goes for creative writing or learning to play the guitar. A creative teacher can only be creative when they've mastered the skills and techniques of teaching. Without those skills, true learning doesn't happen. To be creative and think outside the square, you need to know where the square is. Without learning about the masters, you can't master anything yourself.
Curt, discipline mastery, does it inhibit our creativity? I mean, can't ignorance be bliss?
Someone once postulated that it takes at least 10,000 hours of practice to become a master. So I learned early on that in my journey, that if I focused on the product rather than the process, my curiosity, creativity, artistic expression were inhibited. So I let that end product go. If you take care of the process, the product will take care of itself.
Bruce, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I just don't buy the dichotomy between mastery and ignorance. To me, everyone I ever met that was a master wasn't necessarily creative. They were a great performer or great at doing what had already been done, but they weren't necessarily particularly creative. And I never yet met a novice who was ignorant. They all knew what they were trying to do, even if they hadn't got there yet. So I think it's a false dichotomy. I think it's profoundly dangerous and prejudiced. I think it makes it hard for young people, especially, or people who are disadvantaged, to get into the club. And once people are masters, they can go on for a long time not delivering because they have that label of mastery. So I would rather it was, we're all in this together and you do your thing and I do my thing and it's fine. So this way I'm looking at it is a crucial reason why I think we have to understand creativity more deeply in order to make it more, I guess, egalitarian and make it more universally available. You know, if Curt's making it available to people in prison, some people are in there for a long time, then I mean, that's evidence, right? It's evidence that you can do that.
Why is it so important to learn from the masters in our own journey of learning? Wouldn't it be more creative, like to start with our own imaginations and just go from there? Why do we have to learn so much before we can do something?
Well, I don't necessarily agree with the question. So I think that we can actually start from either place. We can start from learning from what I think what you're inferring by the masters, as well as from our imagination. I do think that there needs to be a time and space in all of our learning where we study, we work alongside how other people have thought about a particular subject, and we begin to understand how they're thinking about it, how they practice, how they have habits of engagement, how they have, you know, how did they pursue that line of thought, and how might that line of thought be something that I could pursue? And then, of course, when it comes to, when I hear the word mastery, I often think of skills. So if it is really about skills, if it is about the technical, then there's a time and place for that, about understanding those technical attributes, or the technical kind of the tool, the knowledge of tools, or the knowledge of particular skills in rendering something. However, if we're only attached to that, if we're only attached to the skills and to the mastery, then we actually lose quite a bit. So that we need to have access to our imaginations and to kind of more flexibility and thinking through our own ideas that are prompting us for further engagement. So I can see in different places in the world where there's been an emphasis on one or the other, perhaps without the other as very much. And, I can see, for instance, when I look in Asian countries where children learn to draw very well, very early, they're very masterful at that, but they may not have access to the imagination as much as they would like. And in fact, they have to go to great efforts to learn how to access their imagination. And the reverse is also in play in other countries where the imagination is facilitated, but we actually need more skills in order to actually achieve as much as people would like to achieve, even with beginning from imagination. So I do think that both are needed, and it is about finding the right time and space for that.
When did life become so serious? When did we forget how to play? Remember how good it felt to lose ourselves? To invent, bond with our friends, have fun? Play teaches children to interact, how to win, how to lose, how to develop logic reasoning. So how do we do it? If it's proven that play is packed with benefits, where do we start? How do we hold on to our creativity through our whole life? Well, for a start, play is not all about talent and genius. Playing is about expressing our creativity in different ways, like gardening, cooking, or poetry. Play helps families bond and helps us all to relax. So play with your mates. Do things for no other reason than it gives you joy. Rather than walk somewhere, skip. People will think you're nuts, but it's just play. Some of the most celebrated people are those who have perfected the adult act of playing. Movie stars, they're paid vast sums of money for this very ordinary skill.
Jonothan, have we forgotten how to play? Is it all just too serious? Have we forgotten? I mean, it's been a shocking year for people all over the world, but have we forgotten the art of play?
I'm not sure. I think there's probably two sides to that. I mean, I think on the very positive side that we've absolutely rediscovered play. That everyday culture, that going insane, that, the amount of board games, the amount of playing with kids, the amount of huge projects that have gone on, that kids are just, again, that need for diversion from the suffering as we turn to play. Mm-hmm. And also, in order to the everyday creativity of survival that Janis talks about also needs to be played for. You need to play with, all right, well, should I become a Deliveroo driver? Should I go and do Uber? Should I do that? You play with those ideas in your mind. Mm-hmm. So on that, but on the negative side, we're controlled, or many people are controlled more and more by performance metrics of one sort or another. Which squeeze out the possibility of play and don't reward play if it doesn't result in something which is tangible and exchangeable in the market in some kind of way. So in that, and we're more serious, and us Anglo-Saxons, the Protestant work ethic, all of that all mitigates against being playful in any case, So, but I think that the pandemic, particularly for I think the important, for me, one of the important populations during the pandemic are parents who are not, not living in extreme poverty or multiple deprivation, are kind of okay, who spent so much time with their children. Mm-hmm. And I think in many cases, I'm sure, have learned to value the way that their children and their children's mental health has been of absolute importance. So I think that there is a, across the globe, there will be parents who now will not argue against creative education, will not argue against play in schools, because they've seen the power of it in their own homes and with their own families.
Janis, can adults learn to be playful?
Well, yes and no. I think all that has been said is quite true, but I would also add, with one or two young families in the streets, that the adults have been exhausted by their children wanting to play all the time when they're trying to juggle the economies of their livelihood, which does provide for the family or the extended family. But the extended family in Europe has been curtailed because obviously those children do not have other adults to relate to. And the crisis there has also been, if they've been homeschooling and they don't have technology, that hasn't sort of engendered any social contact. So yes, and wanting maybe to do other things. I mean, it is interesting, the increase in board games, for example, and other sorts of what you might have called traditional forms of play engagement. And I think adults probably have learned to play a little more when they are allowed to remove themselves from the confines of the domestic interior. But we don't know exactly what the impact will be on that long term. There is a fear now of people leaving their homes, even if lockdown is eased. And I don't know what that will mean to the social fabric.
I mean, I would just, Janis, quite right. I would just like to add to what I said. I mean, that was a particular view of it. I would say the damage of children not playing together and adults not playing together is absolutely profound and will have lasting damage. Right. And if you just turn to adults, I think what some of us experienced in Zoom is that we've lost that playfulness. Yeah. When you come into a physical meeting space, there's a coffee, a bit of banter, a bit of, having a cake, doing and all that. But when you have a Zoom meeting, there's an agenda, you do the agenda and you go. So you've lost that playful intermissions, intermezzos with people that were
eavesdropping and finding ideas and things just from when people are saying things in an office.
Yeah,
I think that's the worst thing. Yeah, that's the most difficult thing is, and you'd understand that coming from theatre and performance, is the anecdote, the aside, the thing that's not particularly at the focus, but gives you a kind of way into another kind of problem-solving scenario. I think that's absolutely true. I think we might say that the creative ensemble is about the social, and as we don't have the social as we've known it, we have to reconstruct that social in so many different ways.
I mean, I'm now convinced that the predetermined agenda is an anti-playful instrument.
Yeah.
Rita, what is it about kids that makes them so good at playing?
So I don't have children myself. My husband has children and grandchildren, and I have many nieces and nephews. And as I've watched them over the years, what really strikes me is that children are invested in the moment. They're actually in the present moment, and they are invested in the experience of that moment. So whereas I think adults are thinking about so much from the past and the future and all of that, I think children are really in the here and now. And so as they're playing in this very presence of whatever activity they're in, they're just they're immersed in it. They're engulfed with it. They're taken up by it. And whether they're doing it on their own or with others, there's just such an amazing investment. And I think we can learn a lot by watching children be invested in that experience. I think the word I'd like us to take away, though, is not just the experience, it's that we are present. We're actually present. I think we spend a lot of our time going through the motions of doing things and doing what we think we're supposed to be doing and keeping up with tasks and to-do lists, etc. But children are not so distracted by that. They're really in that moment, in that place and time, and whatever experience they're involved in. So I think that's what we can really learn from children, and hopefully make sure that we give that space to kids.
Do you ever wonder why Karl Marx wrote in London's Museum Tavern? Why do artists meet in cafes? Where are you most creative? Where do you feel most comfortable creating? Sometimes you need a space to collaborate. Sometimes you need to work on your own. It helps immensely to be flexible with your environment. Maybe your physical environment means moving. Mark Twain was notorious for pacing his study. Mozart always travelled with scraps of paper in his pocket. As painter Bob Ross said, allow for happy accidents. Finally, be prepared for what is known as the door handle conversation. Ever noticed how we have the best ideas just as we're about to end our meeting or visit? Finding your ideal physical environment will do wonders for your creativity. Good luck.
Curt, you've done a lot of work in prisons, and a lot of us would think prisons are not a very creative environment. Where do you start when you want people to think creatively in such a supposedly uncreative environment?
Well, creativity is how early human beings as a species developed and survived. They use creativity to adapt to the ever-changing conditions of the developing world around them. Without creativity, there would have been no adaptation and certainly no survival. In my experience, prisoners were highly creative before they came to prison. Again, often using creativity to adapt to the world around them. And for those who came from childhoods filled with the societal ills of racism, poverty, violence, abandonment, trauma, addiction, and mental illness, creativity and adaptation were essential to their survival. Their creativity was not necessarily applied to positive ends, which may be, well, what brought them to prison. Per square foot, prisons are the most creative places on earth. Prisoners are crammed into spaces that are too crowded, requiring of the inhabitants even more honing of the creativity, adaptability, survival skills that they brought from the streets. Again, their creativity is not necessarily applied to positive ends behind the prison walls. So it's my goal, working in Shakespeare Behind Bars in the Circle of Trust, on art, theater, the collected works of William Shakespeare, and original writing, to move the participants' creativity toward being applied to positive ends. Additionally, intuition, instinct, gut reaction are highly developed in prisons for the same reason as creativity for survival.
How do you personally feel, Curt, when you walk into a prison and you do Shakespeare Behind Bars? Are you nervous, excited, happy? What emotions do you have?
Well, I've been doing it for 26 years. So if it's a circle that I'm starting for the first time, there's a nervous energy there. But so I freely admit I have an enormous amount of hubris when it comes to failure. I simply do not think about failure. I have excluded it. I only care about the process. And because I have created a process that works over and over and over and over again, I'm confident in that process. And there's going to be some failures, right? But if you fear them, it only stifles you. So if I'm going back, I've been out of the prisons, locked out since March 10th. And only being able to have communication with them either through the Postal Service or through correctional email, or sometimes with my juveniles in Chicago, I have the opportunity to be virtual with them. But it's not the same as being in the same room. So I'm eagerly anticipating getting back into the circle. It's where I feel most comfortable. It's where I feel most alive. It's what challenges me as an artist and as a human being. It puts all of my experiences to use. And that's what I crave. That's what I'm addicted to, is to be challenged. So I welcome that. But going back into the prisons after COVID will be a joyful experience for all of us.
What about you, Bruce? What sort of environment do you need to be most creative? Do you need a quiet room? Do you need lots of noise? Do you need lots of people? What do you need to get the most out of your brain?
It depends on the domain. Depends on which area it is that I'm working in. For songwriting, generally solitary, silent. For improvisation, it can be solitary, but often it's best with a group of people, especially if you are of like mind, if you're interested in similar things. For regular writing, like writing scripts or fictional stuff or something like that, mostly it's solitary, but then I like to have music, often jazz or classical or ambient music, never any lyrics, because that just takes the mind somewhere else. I like lyrics, but that just isn't the right context. I often like to do something physical. It's a little difficult in the snow, but ride my bike, take a walk, swim, those kind of things. And that's very good for filmmaking. And so then either consciously or unconsciously, it's often unconsciously, you kind of process of things and then you come back home and suddenly you know how to do it. That's particularly the case with filmmaking, because filmmaking never has an obvious answer. You've got a lot of challenges and there's never an obvious answer, because if you just apply one answer, you move something else and then you've got to, what am I going to do about that, My best thing was always walking my dog, but he died a couple of months ago, so I'm not sure how that's going to.
Oh, I'm very sorry about that. So have you heard the solvitur ambulando? It's Latin, I think, but it's like it is solved by walking. So
yes,
you often come up with the best ideas. Just walk and walk and walk, and you'll just get the best idea in the world, or in the shower.
Yeah, the shower I'm finding, well, in the cold here, it's a little tricky. You're trying to stay warm in the shower. That's the main thing, So, yeah, I know the shower is good, but for me, riding the bike actually is really helpful. Although you do have to keep your mind on the traffic, so there is that.
And you can't write things down on a bike either. That's awkward.
No, although it's interesting now. There's so many devices. We have so many devices. You can, I can have my iPhone strapped to me and I can have my earphones in and I can just talk to Siri and she can take notes, so yeah, it's so different than when I started. I mean, Curt would say the same thing. It's just so different than when you started. But I'm one of those people that just likes to pick up the next thing and play with it. I'm not particularly committed to how I learned it. In fact, I quite like figuring out how to do things I didn't learn when I started out.
That's trust, isn't it? That's like trusting the process. You've done so much work over the years, so many creative projects that you trust that it will arrive. You will somehow remember it. They say that if you've got a song in your head and you don't write it down, it'll eventually, if it's good enough, it's going to come back to you anyway. It's just a trust thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I just on that note, particularly writing longer pieces, I trust the piece. There's a saying with scripts that the script will tell you, the characters will tell you. When you get far enough into it, you can hear the characters speaking. And it's weird. I mean, you have this feeling, I'm going to write your dialogue. And they kind of say, no, shut up. I'm going to write the dialogue. That's how it goes.
So, Jonothan, we can imagine an artist working alone in the studio or someone maybe working in their office, but also a group of artists working together on a project, or the ever popular open plan office environment. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my background is in the performing arts, so I don't really imagine artists working on their own. For me, ensemble, the idea of actors working together in harmony and synchronizing and with amazing skill and dexterity is my model of the artist, as is the jazz band or as is the orchestra. But even if we look at visual artists, if you look at the work of Richard Sennett around the atelier and the behaviors of artists when they're working in cramped, closed spaces and finding ways around each other and moving from kiln to stone to canvas to whatever, and sharing that space and working around each other, and the kind of discourses that come out of that is hugely popular. And you know, my background is partly in business education, and we teach that. We teach how artists work together and what it means to be an artistic team to executives. So I think that that's absolutely important. But of course, the key distinction is around agency. You know, the agency that artists have sharing and working in a studio together is not necessarily the same as agency of office workers in an open plan office. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's the defining thing. Artists working together have their own agency. They can come and go when they please. They can do their own work. They can talk to each other. They can share. They can critique. But ultimately, they are their own bosses. Whereas people in those spaces may be all on the same routine task. They may be all under surveillance. They may, in any case, be in an open space which is completely bracketed off from everybody else. You know, they may not have agency. And for me, throughout all of this, agency is the key dimension of creativity. If you don't have agency, you can't be creative. To be creative is to have agency. So in that open plan office, it depends on the extent to which the organizational culture gives those workers in that space the agency to be discretionary about their time, you know, to not be sanctioned if they take time out to have a conversation or to do something different. You know, it's all about what is the nature of agency in those spaces. Just putting people together doesn't necessarily make them creative.
Well said. What about you, Janis? Does the physical environment matter for creativity, and if so, how?
Well, I think Jonathan's raised a very interesting point about agency. And at the moment, because we are in this pandemic, I think we have to recognize that there are shifts in ways of working. So the idea of the traditional office or open plan has been brought into question. And whether or not people return is an issue that people are looking at in terms of the work-life balance. It might have been thought that creativity at one point before pandemic operated in that idea of leisure time. So the day and the evening may have been divided into those sorts of functions. And now I think this whole kind of, you know, whether it's self-renovating or building or doing all sorts of things that might be upcycling or recycling have shifted. So even if I've had friends working from home who started with what they might have called a sort of work routine and continued with some of their creative activities, but now they've all kind of merged because there isn't this, even if there was a 9 to 5, which hasn't always applied to a range of practitioners, it's according to how your biorhythms might work or your mental health or whether you were homeschooling, all sorts of things have shifted. So finding ways of dealing with, you know, it could be boredom, it could be stress, it could be your mental health. But this revival, I would say, of creative self-made projects, particularly using technology, has vastly increased, which has generated other sorts of economies with all the different platforms available. So this agency that Jonathan spoke of is sort of diversifying and spreading. And to go back to the point about the cultural economy, or whether our sort of politicians who are rather suspect in certainly Northern Europe, think about just an object. They don't necessarily think about the processes of creativity. They think of it only in commercial terms. So in fact, the crisis in our own institutions are mitigated really with monies that have been offered, but only really for commercial output, not for what you might call the creative expression of agencies, whether individual, but certainly collective, when you come to the uses of technology. It's been quite extraordinary, I think, that proliferation. Whether people are organizing orchestras across the world through Zoom, or whether trying to do projects. We have some local projects here on the Southeast Coast, and they're being entirely done by Zoom. And it's quite interesting to sort of negotiate who's making what and where in what kind of spaces in order to deliver something which really is just for the community.
Innovation might be the final outcome of a creative process. It often means making something new to sell. The result is often the culmination of ideas into a new product. So what exactly is the difference between innovation and creativity? Put simply, creativity is bigger than innovation. Innovation relies on the imagination of creativity. Innovation is productive. There is often a financial risk in innovation. Innovation is often improving on what existed before, not making something brand new. Each step of development involves innovation. It comes from an idea of making things better than they are.
Jonothan, what's more important, creativity or innovation, and why?
So, I guess the easy answer would be, well, they're both important, and they're both part of the same process, therefore they're equally important. But I guess, if push comes to shove, then innovation, because innovation is about making something out of creative activity. I mean, creativity, the old Ken Robinson was always imaginative activity fashioned so as to make something. Mm. And my problem with that used to be that it undervalues imagination, because imagination is less concrete, less tangible, has less obvious outputs, but is absolutely the bedrock of it all. But you can be creative, you can have ideas and ideas and ideas, but if you can't turn those ideas into some product, service, or experience, then it remains enjoyable and pleasurable and giving people, giving yourself satisfaction, but it's not a change in the world. Mm. So for me, if I'm pushed to say, but I'm not entirely comfortable with doing it, innovation is more important, because innovation makes a difference to the world.
Innovation. What do you think, Janis?
Well, I think I would agree, except at the moment, because we are under this particular state of play in the world. I think anyone who has any creative release is probably doing extraordinarily well. I mean, I think creativity leads to experiment and then may lead to innovation. I think at the moment it's about survival. So I am aware that a lot of the collective and group projects in the DIY, they may not go anywhere, but I think they've released something that has meant people are coping, and we all have to find coping strategies at the moment. So I'm slightly agreeing and yet modifying, because we're living in a particular bubble.
Problem posing, when the problem has not been solved by anyone before. For example, let's look at the humble flat white. The world already had lattes and cappuccinos, but a botched espresso became a new favourite. The flat white was like a latte, but smaller and with less milk. Somebody looked at coffee from a different perspective. Working out what the problem is different than working out how to solve the problem. What about road traffic management? Problem posing is about asking a different question. How do you free up motorways as opposed to how do I get across town? Ramp lights. They're essentially traffic lights that manage traffic flow from two-lane on-ramps onto the motorway during peak periods and other busy times. Problem solved. So, what problems haven't been solved yet? Well, that's half the fun.
Wow!
I don't know about you, that was great.
That was fantastic.
Yeah, no, I
It
loved
was really cool. I just wanted to thank our incredible friends who have helped us today. All the people you've heard from have been creative fellows in the Creative Thinking Project, which was the project that occurred before we set up the Centre for Arts and Social Transformation. And each one of them visited New Zealand and went up and down the country with us, speaking to people about why it's important to be creative. It was a movement that started, 7 or so years ago, and we're still on this journey in New Zealand to let everybody know that these creative skills and being creative is a really important thing for our future, for our well-being,
for our present,
education, for being human.
And let's not forget it for thanking people, to thank Justin. At the heart of being creative is asking questions, and watching Justin's skilled at doing that and opening up the conversation with our experts from around the world.
Yeah. So,
kia ora, mate.
It's a researcher who actually, created the 11 dimensions or led the creation of the 11 dimensions of the creative environment. What do you feel about what people have said? How are you reacting to that?
Well, the great thing about exploring the creative process, it's always in a state of becoming. You never actually get to the end and go, oh, we've worked it out now, we understand it. Understanding what's at the heart of who we are as human beings, we'll never finally go, oh, that's it. So what really excited me about this was listening to people talking about it because they understood the creative process inside prisons. Others talking about understanding the creative process because of what happens inside the brain. Others talking about it in terms of their role as arts educators. And when we start to put that together, to crystallise that, in other words, looking at this idea of the creative process through different lenses, we mightn't arrive at the truth, but we arrive at a range of different ways of understanding it. So what today's done for me, it's raised a number of questions, some other thinking, some other possibilities and other wondering. So that's great, keeps me in a job.
Yeah, that's true. And when you say that, it makes me realise that we did get a lot of different perspectives of people who've come from different backgrounds in their work, but we haven't actually got a lot of cultural differences and diversity. So the conversation must keep going.
And absolutely, that's an important challenge for us all, isn't it? To make sure that our understanding of creative process isn't a Eurocentric kind of view of the world, which dismisses so easily other ways of knowing.
Absolutely.
Hey, if you wanted to know more, Amy, and you wanted to connect with us, it's really simple, eh?
How would I do it?
Well, you send an email to the Centre for Arts and Social Transformation, and that's cast, CAST, at Auckland, AUCKLAND.ac.nz, and we'll get back to you.
We'd love to hear from you. I hope that today you have made sure that you know that you are creative, that we are all creative, and that we've got to continue to work on our creative skills.
O aha, ko au. I'm creative. Ka kite anō.
Ati wā.